Financial Times was on to something.
I am relieved that you decided to postpone publication of the unclassified document. My meeting yesterday showed there is more work to ensure that the figures are accurate and consistent with those of the US. But even the best survey of Iraq's WMD programs will not show much advance in recent years. The programs are extremely worrying, but have not, as far as we know, been stepped up.
But the American military were stepping up maneuvers in the Gulf region. For the White House, it was no longer whether there was going to be an invasion. It was when.
Well, the first time I came away persuaded that a war was 99% likely was in early July of 2002 during one of my regular sessions with Condoleezza Rice, then the National Security Advisor. I was uneasy about it, thought that it raised questions to me, at least, whether it was worth it. And when I began to raise these concerns, Condi's reaction was essentially, save your breath, hold your fire. This decision's pretty much been made. This is where the president is.
By now, MPs were asking Mr. Blair about British military planning.
Are we then preparing for possible military action in Iraq?
No, there are no decisions that have been taken about military action.
Prime Minister, you recall...
True, no formal military commitment had been given, but British troops were already preparing for possible armed action, the very question Mr. Blair had been asked. As he spoke, Britain had already been participating for 3 weeks in joint war planning with the Americans.
I constantly say to people there are no decisions that have been made in relation to Iraq at all.
It's perfectly plain from the events that Tony Blair probably committed himself to the invasion back in spring of 2002. He could never openly admit to that. He could never be frank that his main motivation was to demonstrate Britain was the closest ally to a Republican president of the United States.
A week later, the Prime Minister chaired a highly sensitive meeting. It may prove to be one of the most significant on his road to war. Just back from Washington was the head of MI6. Military action, he reported, was inevitable. Several well-placed sources have told us that Sir Richard Dearlove was minuted as saying the facts and the intelligence were being fixed round the policy by the Bush administration. By fixed, the MI6 chief meant that the Americans were trawling for evidence to reinforce their claim that Saddam was a threat. Not for the first time, the Foreign Secretary questioned whether the threat was sufficient to justify invasion.
My understanding is that at that meeting, Jack Straw made clear, I think, his view that the case was thin, as it was put, and that other countries, such as Libya or Iran or North Korea, had a greater weapons of mass destruction capability than Iraq.
The Prime Minister was now in a race against time to persuade Labour MPs and the public that intelligence on Iraq justified invasion. But as it stood, the government knew the intelligence might not be convincing. 2/3 of MI6's reports on Iraq came from just 2 main sources. MI6 was now tasked to extract as much intelligence as possible from their few agents.
There was an appeal, if you like, for people to look and think very closely about the evidence that was available.
This intelligence trawl was intended to build up the government's dossier. News that the dossier was going to be reworked soon spread around Whitehall.
It was mentioned to me by a colleague in the margins of a meeting in Whitehall. Our shared reaction was that that would be a considerable challenge because of the relatively sparse nature of the intelligence available on Iraq's WMD.
The Bush administration was so convinced the British Prime Minister had committed himself to regime change that some of them began to talk publicly about having allies.
Let there be no mistake, our policy insists on regime change in Baghdad, we are content that at the appropriate moment we will have the requisite degree of international support.
But if you don't have it, and all the indications are that at the moment you won't, then what?
We will have it, Mr. Humphreys.
Another Bush insider also said he was confident about one ally in particular, Britain.
Our European allies are just not relevant to this, and the one of some importance, the United Kingdom, is, I believe, going to be with us.
Remarks like these put the Foreign Office in a spin. The Foreign Secretary flew to America to interrupt the holiday of the US Secretary of State, Colin Powell. We understand Jack Straw complained, "You've outed us." He said the British government had yet to prepare public opinion.
Stop this filthy attack!
Stop this filthy attack!
Any excuse to bomb Iraq!
Any excuse to bomb Iraq!
Tony Blair, shame, shame!
Tony Blair, shame, shame!
Half the country was still opposed to war. Mr. Blair decided now was the time to publish the dossier the Joint Intelligence Committee was to approve. The demands from Downing Street on the intelligence services to provide more material became urgent.
Number 10, through the chairman, want the document to be as strong as possible within the bounds of available intelligence. This is therefore a last call for any items of intelligence that agencies think can and should be included.
Was Downing Street now doing what the chief of MI6 had warned that the Bush administration was doing, trawling around for new intelligence to fit its new policy? At the Hutton inquiry, the Prime Minister was asked why he chose September to publish the dossier.
We have also heard that on the 3rd of September, you do announce that the dossier is going to be published.
Yes.
What changed?
What changed was really two things which came together. First of all, there was a tremendous amount of information and evidence coming across my desk as to the weapons of mass destruction and the programs associated with it that Saddam had. There was also a renewed sense of urgency again in the way that this was being publicly debated.
It now seems less surprising that so much information was coming across the Prime Minister's desk. After all, MI6 had gone looking for it, following that crucial meeting chaired by him in July, when it was decided to build up the intelligence case. Mr. Blair has always denied the purpose of the dossier was to make the case for war. As the Americans built up their forces in the Gulf, he kept saying no decisions had been taken. Yet privately he had been told war was inevitable, which might explain why the Prime Minister recalled Parliament in September to launch the dossier.
I'm aware, of course, that people are going to have to take elements of this on the good faith of our intelligence services. But this is what they are telling me, the British Prime Minister, and my senior colleagues. The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative.
True, the Joint Intelligence Committee had judged Iraq had a chemical and biological weapons capability. But only 2 weeks earlier, they'd reminded the Prime Minister their judgment was based on limited intelligence. Not that you'd have known that from the dossier.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
The government's claims that Iraq was now actively making weapons which could be swiftly deployed were based substantially on just 2 new intelligence sources. Both sources had supplied this information since MI6's call in July went out to build up the intelligence base. Mr. Blair was briefed about both sources by the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, Sir Richard Dearlove, just days before he presented his dossier to Parliament.
Sir Richard, hello.
Sir Richard told Mr. Blair that one of the 2 news sources was claiming to know where a chemical agent was being produced. but he was untried and untested.
I'd like to brief you on SIS's main sources, including a news source on trial. The news source is potentially important. I can give you our understanding of his access. However, the case is developmental and the source remains unproven. But if you're happy,
The second news source was linked to an Iraqi opposition group with an obvious interest in toppling Saddam. SIS had only 3 other main sources, and Mr. Blair was told their reports were unremarkable or hearsay.
The news source came in and was able to provide...
What the Prime Minister told Parliament, however, had none of these qualifications.
His weapons of mass destruction program is active, detailed and growing. The policy of containment is not working. The weapons of mass destruction program is not shut down. It is up and running now.
You're saying you think that all the way through he knew how thin it was?
He saw the evidence. I mean, he probably saw more of the evidence than any other single person in government. Therefore, he was well placed to judge how thin it was.
But he said it was extensive, detailed and authoritative. You're saying he made that...
I think you'll have to ask him how he justifies that.
But this is quite an important point, this gap between what we now know he knew and what he said in public. You still are of the view that that gap can be explained by good faith, not by dishonesty.
I've no doubt he believed that those weapons were there. What surprised me, astonished me about the September dossier was how one-sided it was. It was propaganda. It was not an honest presentation of intelligence.
There has been a real concern on our part not to exaggerate the intelligence that we get, but I have to say that, I mean, one of the things that is difficult to reflect for very obvious reasons is the credibility of it. And we rate the credibility of what we have in relation to this very high. I'll say no more than that.
But there wasn't much more to say anyway about the intelligence on Saddam's weapons. Lord Butler's review of Britain's intelligence on Iraq said,
"We were struck by the relative thinness of the intelligence base.
By early autumn, the Americans were planning for a likely invasion early in 2003. The Ministry of Defence stepped up Britain's Iraq planning. At Camp David, the Prime Minister met President Bush. There, he urged Mr. Bush to seek international backing through the UN for any action against Saddam. Mr. Blair has subsequently said this about what transpired at the summit.
There was no detailed discussion of the military option at that time because we believed that it was possible to avoid conflict.
No detailed discussion about the military option. But there was a firm commitment by Mr. Blair to provide British troops, according to a more recent account sourced direct to the President himself. The Prime Minister has also said this about what happened at Camp David.
The idea that I made some secret agreement with George Bush back last September that we would invade Iraq in any event at a particular time is also completely and totally untrue.
Again, the two leaders may not have agreed a particular time for an invasion. But Mr. Blair had already decided the UN should not have the last word as to whether they should invade. When the Prime Minister pledged British troops, he is said to have looked the President in the eye and pledged, "I'm with you." The President then told Mr. Blair's aides, "Your man has cojones," Spanish slang for male courage. For Mr. Blair, UN weapons inspectors were the key to getting rid of Saddam. They had packed their bags in Iraq in 1998 after the dictator had ceased meaningful cooperation. The Prime Minister and the President had decided to get them back by means of a new disarmament resolution. We now know that in Washington in March 2002, there had been a discussion at the British Embassy on how sending back the inspectors might be used to trigger an invasion. The ambassador, Sir Christopher